Welcome to Blast Off with Angular Material. Today we're going to get some hands-on practice with the Angular Material library, and we're going to see how we can build great-looking apps fast. I'm Rachel Noccioli. I'm a software developer at Oasis Digital, and I'm an Angular Bootcamp instructor. As a software developer at a consulting company, I've had my share of clients who haven't had the resources or the desire to go through a full design process. And it's not that they didn't care about design, because I can only imagine what would happen if we wrote the templates in the TypeScript and then didn't ship any CSS. I just don't think that that would go over very well. So that's what brought us to using Angular Material, because we were able to learn one system and then use it for multiple apps for multiple clients with great success. But notice that I said the word system. And by that, I mean the underlying design system, material design. And so today, we're going to talk about why we should use an explicit design system, what is material design specifically, and then we're going to do a workshop where we're going to build an app and learn some more about Angular Material and material design along the way. So yesterday during Stephen Fluen's talk, he mentioned that every app is using a design system, whether it's an explicit one like material design or just kind of the ad hoc evolution of the look and feel of that's been created as you create your app. Everyone's using a design system, but today we're going to talk about these explicit design systems, which are like a style guide for your visual and UI design. We're going to, by using a design system is going to define what the individual pieces of your app should look like and how they will be, how they'll be composed and how they interact with each other. Courtney Clark wrote, "A design system is a series of components that can be reused in different combinations, allowing companies to manage design at scale." So by using a design system, you are leveraging the decisions that are made at the beginning about what all the pieces should look like so that you get a consistent look and feel throughout, and you don't end up with 20 different buttons with different sizes and colors and different form UIs, et cetera. But what if your team or your company or your client doesn't have the resources to create a design system, a custom design system? In this case, you can use an open source design system that's been created by these large companies that created these design systems for themselves, but then put out some information about them for use by all of the developers outside of the org. And VMware's Clarity, Salesforce's Lightning, and IBM's Carbon are a few examples of open source design systems. But of course, today we're going to talk about Google's material design. And material design, we can find more information about that at material.io. And the tagline is, "Build beautiful products faster." So by using material design, we can leverage all of the design decisions that have been made by the teams at Google to create our own apps. And I'm going to point out in this design section, there's all of this information about how to use the design system. So like I said, these organizations have created these for internal use, but then they've put information out to the public about how to use them. And so here in environment, we can get some information about sort of the philosophy of what material is. And material is sort of built on this metaphor of paper, where we have sheets of paper in the real world, and then it's sort of reimagined for digital devices. So there's all this information about how this metaphor kind of manifests itself within the design system. So there's guidance about what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and information about how shadows work, because there's different elevations. So we have some information about how all of the different pieces in your app are going to kind of look. But the material team likes to say that material is an adaptable design system. It's not that every app has to look exactly the same. Not every material app is going to use the exact same UI features. You can, specifically with Angular material, you can customize the colors and typography to fit the branding experience for your particular customer. So specifically, what is Angular material? It's an Angular component library that implements material design. So you can use Angular material just as a component set of various components and pick and choose which ones you want, but you'll get the full power of Angular material when you look at it as this implementation of a design system. And I'm going to go to the documentation. So we'll be at material.angular.io. And here we can find the main docs for Angular material. And the Angular material team is part of the Angular team at Google, which is kind of a big benefit because they're working closely with the framework authors to create a great experience for us as developers who are using that framework. So again, there's a lot of information here in the docs. We're going to become familiar with how the docs work when we get to the workshop. But first, let's just talk about how we can get started with Angular material. So there's this schematic that's built into Angular. So if you just run ng-add @angular/material, it's going to do some code generation for you. It'll do some npm installs. It's going to add a little bit of code. And this is, of course, only going to work if you're using a CLI application. But if you are not, then you can get information about what this schematic is doing. And either way, it's good to know the specific details about how that install process works. But it's not required for you to get up and running with Angular material. In the workshop, we are going to be using StackBlitz. So, and StackBlitz doesn't support running like arbitrary commands right now. So I've already run that ng-add @angular/material for you. But I just want you guys to be familiar with what that's going to be. OK, so the workshop is going to be found at the, I created this bit.ly for easy navigation. So it's bit.ly/blast-off-am. So if everyone can take a minute to navigate to that site, you will find a GitHub repo that I've created for this workshop. Down here in the README, we have a link to the final demo. Just be sure to open that in a new tab so that you can keep the instructions open. And like I said, we're going to be working in StackBlitz. So that's going to open up a StackBlitz link. I'm going to open the app in a new window so we can see it full screen. And today we're going to be building an astronaut directory. So we're going to get some information about all the current NASA astronauts. And then have a faceted search with using all Angular material components. So almost all of this page is Angular material components. There's very little HTML on here that I've had to write other than the content. So we have a header across the top, and then we have a menu over here. I can make this a little bit bigger if that helps. We have these cards here in the center, and each card is going to have some information about one of the NASA astronauts. And we can see all of the astronauts here. And then over here we have a form field with an input. So if I click there, we can search astronauts. It's not quite wired up. I tried to keep this demo focused on the HTML and CSS for really focusing on the Angular material pieces. And then we also have this list of the number of spacewalks and then the undergraduate major. So these are Angular material lists. And then in here we have this Angular material divider. I don't know if that's totally obvious on the projector, but. OK, so that is what we're going to be building today. Let's see what step 1 is going to be. Ooh, yeah. So for step 1, we are going to add a mat toolbar component. But before you get started, let's just go take a look at the documentation to see how we're going to do that. So up here in the documentation, we have the components screen. And then in navigation, we have this toolbar. So here we get some information about the usage of the toolbar. And this information where it says mat toolbar is a container for headers, titles, or actions is kind of a callback to material design. And it's giving us some information about like why this component was created. And it's not just like, oh, if you want a gray rectangle or whatever color rectangle on your screen, there's sort of a purpose behind it coming from the material design spec. So the next piece of information here is an example with the basic toolbar. And if you click the open close brackets, you can actually see the source code for that little example. And it's pretty simple. All you need is a mat toolbar opening tag. The Angular material prefix is going to be MAT. So every component will have that MAT prefix. And then just the content, and then the closing tag. And there's no TypeScript really, and there's no CSS for a toolbar. So then we get a little bit of information about the usage of the toolbar. And if we want a single row or multiple rows, the default is just a single row with some content. All right, that's what we're going to create today. And some information about theming, and then some information about accessibility. And I'll just point out here that it says, generally, the toolbar is used as a header where role equals heading would be appropriate. And in our case, we are, in fact, doing that. We're creating a header for our page. We're going to use an h1 tag to include the words for our title. And so we're going to use that role equals heading. One other part that I'm going to point out is in the API, where we have information about how to get access to this particular component. So we did, with that schematic, we have done an npm install of Angular Material, but Angular Material is broken out into separate ng modules. So pretty much every component has its own ng module. So every time you want to use a component, you will have to do this import and then also add it to the imports of the ng module where you're trying to use the Angular Material component. So if you have a more complex app with multiple modules and you're trying to use the toolbar in 3 different modules, you'll have to import it into each of those modules. Then there's just a little bit of information about what the individual directives are. So we're going to be just using the mat toolbar, but if you had multiple rows, you'd also have a mat toolbar row. and then some information about the properties where it has the input, color, and its theme palette. So a theme palette is, let's just jump back to the overview, to this theming section, where it says that the color can be changed with the color property. By default, it has a neutral background. That's that gray that we saw before. But it can be changed to primary, accent, or worn. So that is, those are the different values that you can use for that theme palette. And then if this component had any methods available to us, then they would also be listed here. And then we finally have some, an example of a more complicated toolbar. So we can open that up to see the code for the more complicated one. But of course, we're going to just be making a pretty simple one today. So back over in the step, we will see the different instructions for getting this step completed. The first one is import the Mat Toolbar module into app module. And if you're not sure what to do for any of these steps, notice this little black triangle, and if you click on that or the instruction, it'll open it up and it'll show you the code. So I would encourage everyone to try to look at the docs and really think about what the step is trying to get you to do. And if you get stuck, don't worry because the code is there, but do try to work on the step on your own first. And then the second part is replace the welcome message with the toolbar. So to get started, you're going to follow this instruction here. Open this stack blitz to get started. So again, open that in a new tab. And I'm going to open the completed demo so that we can see what the UI will look like once we're done. All right, so that'll just take a minute. So once you're done with this step, you should have a purple header, and it should say astronaut directory. OK, so let's take a few minutes to work on that. If you have any questions, raise your hand, and I'll come around, or my coworker Paul here will be available to assist you. So we can see the code here that is also in the GitHub repo, but we just added the Mat toolbar. We use that color equals primary to get the theming. And then we included an H1 tag with astronaut directory. And of course, we had to add it to the module as well. So we import the Mat toolbar module from Angular/material/toolbar, and then we add it to the imports array of our app module. OK, so before we go to step 2, let's jump back to the slides. We did a walkthrough of the docs for step 1, but I just wanted to reiterate the 3 different parts of the docs. And the first screen that we have for each of the components is going to be the overview, and it'll give you some basic usage and some information about accessibility. And then there's the API screen. It'll tell you specifically how to import the Angular material module into your module. So you're going to need to do that for every component. And then it'll give you some information about the specific properties and methods. And then there will be an example screen, so you can see the code, usually for a slightly more complicated example, or in the case of components that can be used in multiple ways, you'll see an example of each of those ways. OK. So back in the GitHub repo, we can go to step 2. And if you, for whatever reason, weren't able to finish step 1, you can click here on the step 2 setup demo. So don't be worried if you can't get through a step. You can always catch back up with the setup demos. So in this step, we're going to add a side nav component, and we're going to scaffold out the app. So let's go look at the side nav component. Here, we're going to have, actually, let's just look at the example over here. So we're going to kind of scaffold out this, this left bar and then this section over here with the, where the cards are going to be. So at the end, we're going to just have two sections of the app with labels for each section. So in the side nav docs, we can see that it's about collapsible side content. In our case, we're not going to collapse it. We're just going to have it up there. And we'll have a side nav container and then a side nav and a side nav content. So we'll have those, that wrapper is going to be the side nav container, and then we'll have a side nav, a mat side nav will be the left-hand side, and then a mat side nav content will be the right-hand side. So it says that there's going to be a position property, and the position can be start or end. So we'll use position start. And then there's a whole bunch of information on here, but we're not going to need to use most of that. Okay. So we can also see in the API, the side nav is going to be a lot more complicated than the toolbar. So there's a lot more information in here. We are going to, let me jump back to the overview. And it says the opened state can also be set via property binding in the template using the opened property. So you can just put the opened on your side nav, and it'll just always be open. Okay. So jumping back over to step 2, we're going to have to import the side nav module and then add the side nav container and its children that I just mentioned. And then we're going to add some CSS to lay out the page. And we're going to use a little bit of CSS grid today. And pretty much all of the CSS that you're going to write in an Angular Material app is going to be for layout. Because, of course, the Angular Material library can't know what your particular needs are for laying out your app. You're going to have to tell it where to put the components on the page. So mostly you're going to be writing CSS for layout. Hopefully you shouldn't be writing a ton of CSS to override the Angular Material library. Okay, so let's take another few minutes to work through this step. Okay, so with that step, we added our mat side nav container with the mat side nav. We included the mode equals side opened and the role equals region. That was just one of the ARIA tags that was talked about in the accessibility section of the documentation. And then the mat side nav content also got the role equals region, and then we just put main content. And we also had to add the mat side nav module and add it to our imports. And down here. Okay. So I want to jump back to the slides for just a second and talk about some of the benefits of Angular Material. And one of those benefits is visual polish. So when you're using the Angular material library, you're going to have these pre-built components that were inspired by the material design spec. And there is a whole team at Google of visual designers and UX designers who are responsible for creating this library, and leaning on their expertise can be really helpful when your team doesn't have the resources to create a design system or doesn't want to handwrite all of the CSS to create your apps. So you can lean on the Angular material library for that visual polish. One of the other benefits is accessibility. So material design has a whole section of the documentation about accessibility. And there are all of these different these sections talking about how you should, the different things that you need to think about within your apps. And because Angular Material is an implementation of material design, the Angular Material team has paid a lot of attention to making the components accessible. And so they have done a lot of testing and made sure that the components are going to be accessible to people using screen readers or using only keyboard navigation. So you can read more about Material Design's accessibility in their docs. And then you can read more about the accessibility concerns in each of the component documentation steps. So each of the pages is going to have a section about accessibility, and that's basically whatever information the material design team felt that people who are using the library needed to know. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be things that you need to do as a software developer using this library to make sure that the way that you're using the component is going to be accessible. The library can't know about all of the individual use cases that you're using. So in a lot of cases, you have to specify ARIA tags, for example, for screen readers. And then the third way that we can make sure that our apps are going to be accessible is using the component dev kit. And so the CDK is a companion library to Angular Material, and it has some utilities that allow you to manage focus, for example, and you can say, okay, which piece of the app should be focusable if a user is using a keyboard only and can't use a mouse. So that's just one more way that you can make sure that all users are going to be able to use your apps. Okay, so step 3, we're going to start getting some content on our screen. And here we're going to add a MAC card for each astronaut. So over in the documentation, under the layout section, there's card, and it tells us that MAC card is a content container for text, photos, and actions in the context of a single subject. So the material design purpose of using a card is when you have multiple different items and you need to show some information about each different thing. If you notice in the example, each of these cards has a little bit of elevation. So there's a little bit of shadow behind them. If all you're looking for is to have some sort of container with that little bit of shadow, you don't need to use a MAC card. I just want to point out in the guides over here, there is a section about using elevation helpers. So over here, we can find information about how we can use the built-in CSS classes that come with Angular material to get that little bit of shadow, and there's like different levels that you can use. But in the case where we are in fact showing multiple, we have like multiple subjects and we want to display some information, then we're going to use a mat card. So that's what we're doing. We have a whole bunch of astronauts and we need to know some information about them. So there's some information about the basic card sections, and this comes from the material design spec. So a card is going to have, or it can have, a title, subtitle, content, a card image, actions, or a footer. It doesn't really have to have any of these things, but depending on what you want to display to your users, you can use any or all of these. Okay, so back over in the step, I'm going to open the completed demo so we can see what that's going to look like. And if you open this bottom instruction, epic fail. This is not the easiest to read, but you can kind of see the TypeScript type. Each astronaut is going to have a name that's a string. If you see in here, there's an undergraduate major that's a string, just so that you can like put whatever information you want to have for your astronaut. It doesn't need to, like the content of the card is not, like what information you displayed about the astronaut doesn't really matter, but just in case you're wondering. So you're going to add the mat card. You're going to use an ng-for to iterate over all of the astronauts. I've already included the data for you, so there's a property on app component astronauts, and it's an observable of an astronaut array. Okay, so let us know if you have any questions. So here we have our mat cards inside of our mat side nav content. We just used an ng-for to make sure we have one for each astronaut. We have the mat card title with the astronaut's name. Then we have an image with the mat card image directive. And then we bind to the source the astronaut's photo. And then in here, I used a definition list to create those two columns for the keys and the values. And I'll just point out here the classes that I used. I didn't create these, the mat small and the mat body 2. Those are built-in classes to the Angular material library as part of the typography like helpers. All right, and then of course we imported the mat card module, imported it into our ng module, and then added some CSS to give us, again, just those layouts. Okay, so back over in the slides, I have a slide about the speed of development. So this kind of takes two forms, which is on the sort of the design side, you don't have to make a ton of decisions about what everything's going to look like. Your headers are going to kind of follow the pattern. You're going to have the cards. You're going to have all these different guidelines that are going to sort of shape what you're going to build. And then the second piece is that this is, of course, a component library. So the Angular material team has done a lot of work to create these components and write the CSS and the HTML for you, so you don't have to write that all yourself. I did this workshop one other time, and one of the attendees said that they were only using the Angular material library for the inputs that we're going to see in a minute. But he said just using the Angular material for inputs saved him a week's worth of work because he didn't have to think about how to write all those styles and we'll see a little animation that it gives you with the label. Okay, so step 4, we are going to populate that side nav with a search box and those filter options. So you're going to have to open up here to see which ng modules we're going to use. I will open the docs and show the input. And here it says mat input is a directive that allows native input and text area elements to work with mat form field. So when you use a mat input, you're going to be using it within a mat form field component. So I just want to point out that it doesn't specifically say in the API here. It just tells you, oh, import mat input module. You also have to import the form field module. I've definitely run into errors with that. So if you're following the code in my step, of course it's included in there, but in the future when you're trying to use a mat input, just be aware that the mat input and the form field, they're in separate modules, so you have to import both of those. So the basic input is going to be a form field, and then you have a native HTML input with the mat input directive. So we're not creating a component here, we're just adding the directive mat input, and then the library is going to take over the control and add some styling for us. And then here the placeholder is going to have sort of a little special behavior where if I delete this and then I blur, this is what is sort of styled as the placeholder. And then when I click in here, it gets animated up into a label. And technically, under the hood, this is always a label, an HTML label, which is ensuring that this is going to be accessible. But we kind of get that little built-in animation. So one of the things that the install schematic did was import the Angular animations library, the material animations library, and then it added that also to our app module. So we get those little nice, the little helpful animation. And that sort of relates back to the next slide that I have about Angular material, and that's consistency. So when you're using these inputs, your users are going to get sort of used to having that little animation. They're going to get used to looking at the input, knowing what sort of information they need to put into it. There's always going to be some sort of learning curve with learning how to use a new app. But because you're going to be using the same inputs throughout your entire app, the users won't have to constantly relearn where to look for the information. All right, so step 4, we are also going to be using a mat divider to go between that input and then the lists that we'll be using. So over here, we see, where is it? Under layout, there's divider. And then this is super basic. You just have a mat divider open tag and then a mat divider closing tag. So that's just going to give you that thin gray line, just like right here, that you can see on the screen. And then the third thing that we're going to do is use an ng-for over a mat list, and we're going to put the information about each of those different filter groups. So mat list over here under layout, you'll have a mat list component, and then you'll have a mat list item component, and you'll use an ng-for on that to get each of the items. So I will open up what the completed demo will look like, and then let us know if you have any questions. Okay, so let's see the code for this step. So in here we have a nested ng-for. So let me jump way back. We have inside of our mat side nav container, inside of our mat side nav, we have a mat form field, and then an input. And then, of course, we have this mat input, and that's going to give us the styling for the input. And then the placeholder is going to give us that label with that little animation. Then we put a mat divider underneath the search section. And then we have an ng container for each of the filters. So we have an ng-for let filter of filters, and the filters are an observable, so we pipe async. And then we're just capturing which one is the last of the filters, and we alias it as itself. So we just call last as last. So down here, we just check to make sure that we're not on the last of the filters, and we put another mat divider so that if we had, for even in this case, we have one mat divider that's going to separate these two sections. So that's this guy down here, but we don't have another mat divider at the end. And then within this ng container, we are going to iterate over a mat list. And then each mat list is going to have a header, and we use the mat subheader directive. And we put the display name, and then we iterate over the mat list items so that we can see each of the potential values that we could be filtering by. So we end up, again, with the search at the top, a mat divider, and then two lists, and then each has a header and then a bunch of mat list items. And in my case, I made them each buttons just for the next step. We'll see what exactly. Well, I guess in here we have a click event, so we need to just make sure that it's going to be something that's focusable. So when you click on the button, it's going to change the filter to the individual one that we clicked on. And visually we don't have anything yet, but in the next step we will see how that's going to work. Okay, so then we again had some CSS, and then we had to import these 5 different modules: mat form field module, mat input module, mat divider module, mat list module, and mat button module to get all of this to work. Okay, so let's jump back to the slides and talk a bit about usability. So usability is just making an experience for your users that is intuitive. And again, the material design team at Google has placed a high priority on making, having high usability, and they have a whole team of usability experts doing research on how to make the individual components usable. So you don't have to worry about, is this particular component going to be intuitive? You can kind of rely on the expertise at Google to make sure that your app is also going to be usable. All right, so then step 5, we are going to turn each of those mat list items, or change that list into a mat chip if, so if I click on a button here, then it's going to turn into a chip to say, okay, I've selected number 2, and then it has a little close button, and that will unselect. And again, the actual filtering is not included in here, so don't be alarmed if this doesn't actually filter. It's mostly just about this UI. Sorry, what? I mean, in this case, like that's not the user experience. I mean, you would just have to like do it a little bit differently. So this isn't like a built-in thing. We're going to see the code for it, and I wrote some code that's going to look at the filter and see if there's a value for that filter, then display a chip instead of the list. So this isn't, unfortunately, this isn't really built in. It's just something that that I sort of borrowed from a Google site. So there's a lot of, with material design, when you're thinking about, okay, what am I going to build? There's material.io, and you can look at the examples that they have in there. And then pretty much all of Google's sites are also using material design, so you can look through those sites. And I kind of pulled this from like a Google Cloud Platform site where they had this like faceted search, and they just kind of did this. So that was my inspiration for this. Okay, so we can see the code for a chip down here. And we're going to have a mat chip list and then a mat chip. And in our case, we're just going to have one chip because it will just have one value. So there's going to be a little bit of code to kind of switch between that mat list and then the mat chip. And again, you can see the code in here if you're not like super comfortable with writing all the like ngIf and whatnot. So I will open the completed demo and then let us know if you have questions. Okay, so for the next step, we are going to jump ahead to step 7, and we're going to come back to step 6. I just want to make sure that we hit step 7 before we close. So step 7 is going to be about theming. So I said earlier that every material app doesn't have to look exactly the same. You can use your own brand's colors and typography to create a sort of like branded experience. And here I have a link to a material theme generator. So if you open that, then you will see this. It's going to make a really easy way to create all of the CSS that you're going to need to modify the colors in your app. So right now we're using the deep purple built-in over here. The deep purple built-in theme. So we have that deep purple at the top, and then there's an accent color. It's like a gold accent color. But we want to actually use the NASA colors. So I pulled the NASA primary and secondary colors from their website. They have their own style guide, and I put those here. So the primary is going to be this hex value, and the secondary is going to be this hex value. So if I just copy this and paste it over here in the primary, and then I copy the other one, and paste that over here. And we'll just leave the warning color as that red. Then it has created this theme. So right now it's in the dark theme. I'm going to just switch it to the light theme. And then all we have to do is press this copy Angular SCSS button at the top, and then it's going to, the website will put all of the CSS in the paste buffer. And if you saw the little, that little notification show up, it just says successfully copied Angular CSS to clipboard. You can also modify the fonts if you'd like. But this is just a quick and easy way to get access to all of the different colors, because it's not just about picking 2 colors. There's kind of a whole bunch of different colors, and it can be a little bit of a challenge to like figure out what all those individual colors should be. So this tool, I didn't create this. It's not like some official tool. It's just something that I found that is actually very useful. So if we paste it, we'll have to create an SCSS file, and there's instructions, of course, in the step. So we're going to create a theme.scss file right next to styles.css, and then we'll paste all of those styles. And then you just have to update the Angular JSON file to also include this new CSS file. If you don't update Angular JSON, the build process isn't going to pull in those CSS styles. So I'm just going to show what the generated code was. It has a lot of lines of CSS that you can then customize, but this is a good jumping off point to creating your own theme. So I just wanted to make sure that we hit this step so that everyone kind of has a foundation for understanding how they can update their theme. So let's just take a couple of minutes to go through that process and add the NASA theme to our app. Leaves. I just wanted to also point out that there's another step that I kind of had hidden. So if you go up into code and go to the steps and then go to step 8, there's some like additional material that I just wanted to include just in case we had extra time, which it doesn't look like we're going to have. But I can show you what that looks like. So for the very last bonus step, we have this floating action button down here at the bottom, and it has an icon with a plus button, so we can click on that. Oh, cool, it doesn't work. Fail. It worked locally on my computer. Yeah, I have some sort of, I'm pretty sure I know what the issue is, and I will push an update. Oops, why am I doing that? Oh, Matt Date Picker. I'm going to push an update to this, but the floating action button pops up a dialog, and it has a form with a few other form controls, and not just the input. It has a date picker, which is the problem that I'm having here, and also a select. So you can kind of see a couple of other examples, and then there's like the instructions for step 8, those like hidden step 8 instructions take you step by step through wiring all of that up. So I just wanted to point that out. Was there a question? Wait, hang on. No, I don't. The search isn't implemented. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, step 8, yeah. So if you go, so this is the general GitHub repo. If you click on steps, then there's a hidden step 8 down here. It just isn't linked to from the other steps. Any other questions? OK. I'm going to stick around for a few more minutes. The step 6 that we skipped was just adding that an icon at the top with a map menu. And so you can kind of see how you can create a menu with some buttons. And I just kind of mocked out a little log out button with the map menu. All right, well, thanks for coming, everyone.